You should think up for yourself. Hello, I think we're online now. Welcome to tonight's broadcast for Express Media. My name is Felicity Castagna. So I write for both children and adults, and my last book is, this one called The Incredible Here and Now, which is set right where we're sitting in Carman. Tonight we're going to be talking about voice and character with Luke Carman. As I was just saying to him before we went live on air, I think he's the absolute best person in Australia to be talking to you about what voice and character is, because I think lots of authors obviously write with characters. We all write with characters, but not many authors manage to achieve characters who are as original as Luke's, and not many people manage to go beyond writing merely technically good writing to writing text that has great voice and style. And that's what I think that Luke Carman does, and that's why it's such a pleasure to have him here with us tonight. So Luke Carman is the author of this book, An Elegant Young Man, which won him the Sydney Morning Herald Young Novelist of the Year, as well as the New South Wales Premier's Awards. He's very well known around the literary circuit as a very engaging speaker and as an author that is one to watch for future years. So I want to start by asking Luke to do a little reading from his book, and so that we get a sense of his style and voice, and then we're going to be talking about his text and how he writes great characters and writes with great style and voice. If you would like to ask us a question, please ask us a question via Twitter, and ask us via Express Media's Twitter stream. Okay, so to kick things off, Luke, can you read for us, please?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks for being so generous with that introduction. I'm just going to read the opening sequence from the book, which is called Whitman and the Whitlam Centre. My name is Luke Francis Carman. Don't call me Mr. Carman. That's my mother's name for me when sorting out the mail. Example, here's one for you, Mr. Carman. Sometimes she says, stop it, you're acting like your father, but only when she's really mad. I'm never really acting like him. I'm never really looking like him either. He has a real beard. He has real facial hair. Mine's all on neck. It's weird. I saw Groucho Marx the other day. He was on YouTube. He was 81 years old. His mustache was in great condition for a dead guy. You know what I read the other day? I read that all we leave is a memory. I read it on the back of a demolition company truck as it cut me off on Cabramatta Road. I'm serious. I'm pretty much alone in this stance, but I don't reckon there should be any such thing as heritage listing. I say all those old buildings are just taking up space a block of units could fit into. I'm serious. You know, take everyone's backyards away while you're at it. And no fooling. I'm not afraid of overcrowded. I want to see people crammed in together like chunks of fish in a tuna can. That ought to cure the loneliness that's going around. People need each other. In my vision of the future, there's somebody to serve in every kitchen. I found someone the other day. It was Walt Whitman under a broken cabinet outside the Whitlam Centre. The Whitlam Centre is a place in Liverpool where they have swimming pools and boxing rings. It's sort of a big deal. Anyway, there's a complete works of Walt Whitman just lying there. It wasn't the first time I come across him. He was in an Allen Ginsberg poem I read once. Walt Whitman in the supermarket. I like the idea. I still like it. I took Whitman with me around Liverpool for a bit. He gave me some crazy ideas about everything. Like, even though I was wearing Dad's old flannel shirt and blue jeans Mum bought my brother last Christmas, Whitman reckoned there was as much to me as any poem, maybe more. But most of his ideas don't make any sense to me. They're just like his songs. But sometimes things are all right, even if they don't make any goddamn sense. And the things you can think with Walt Whitman. That last sentence is a Dr. Seuss reference. You know, Dr. Seuss isn't a real doctor. He's not even a real Seuss. Have you ever been on that website where the guy sings Dr. Seuss while imitating Bob Dylan? It's epic, as they say. I hate the way they say epic these days. Singing Dr. Seuss while imitating Bob Dylan certainly isn't random. I hate the way everything's random these days. Almost nothing's random. Us, Professor Dawkins. Professor Dawkins is a real professor. He's also a real Dawkins. I talked to Walt Whitman about Bob Dylan. I said, the times they are a-changing. I said, the line it is drawn, the curse it is cast, the slow one now will later be fast as the present now will later be past. The Whitman sang back to me, let that which stood in front go behind, let that which was behind advance to the front, let bigots, fools, unclean persons offer new propositions, let the old propositions be postponed, let a man seek pleasure everywhere except in himself, let a woman seek happiness everywhere except in herself. I found this singing a little belligerent. I said, oh, Whitman, the thinks you can think.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
I'm sure that if we were in front of people at the moment, everyone would be cheering. I'm sure that they're
I'm sure.
cheering behind their cameras on their computers at the moment. Okay, well, that was fantastic. I think that from Luke's reading, we can get a sense that he has this absolute individual style. So I often think that when we have voice, when we have style, when we are good at characters, the book itself has a personality. So I can recognize the personality of this book as being different than this book, just like I could hear that on the telephone that one person is different from another. I could take out any page of your book and any page of another book and know that they have distinct personalities. But that's incredibly hard to achieve. So again, lots of writers are good at kind of writing technically good stuff, writing clear stuff, but they're not good at having that unique individual style. So I want to start to discuss these issues from the point of your book is narrated, the main character is also called Luke Carman, just like you, which is a bit confusing at some point. Is it fiction or autobiography? Why did you choose to write a book in which the main character is also called Luke Carman?
Okay, well, that's usually the first question I get asked, and it's I understand that it's natural that people have an interest in whether or not it's autobiographical, whether or not it's based on real events or whatever it might be. But in my opinion, there's a misunderstanding there, that not in the question itself, but in the way that people approach fiction that is seemingly autobiographical. And the misunderstanding is that that anything that has an autobiographical element is therefore sort of a pseudo autobiography. That if it's about somebody's real life, then that puts it in the genre of autobiography. And in my opinion, that's not the way that it works. It's an opinion. I could be completely wrong, but from my point of view, when you call something fiction, you're not saying it's not autobiographical. You're not saying it's not true. You're not saying that it's something that you've just invented, that's pure imagination, or that has no connection to reality in any way. Calling something fiction is just a way of signaling to the reader that that they should approach the text in a certain way. So even if everything in this book was absolutely plausible, believable, and true to some sort of documentary level, it would still be, in my opinion, pure fiction, in the sense that there's no contractual obligation, if you like, between the author of this book, happens to be me, and the reader, that there's any veracity to any of this, which is very different from saying that it's true or false. I think good fiction is concerned with truth in some way, and it's also concerned very much for that reason on a kind of individuality. And just simply calling the character Luke Francis Carman was an attempt to underline the fictive nature of the book, which sounds contradictory, but it's a technique. It's an approach that's extremely old. It goes back to some Balzac's dialogues from God knows when, I don't know, a long time ago. But it's almost ancient, and it is confusing. But then again, that's part of the, in my opinion, part of the intrigue of literature, is that it is confusing. It's full of contradictions. The character has my name, but obviously the character is not me. And I think that's part of what's so interesting about fiction, is that it's like reality, but it's not reality. It's not life. It's something else, some sort of strange parallel to it. So I think that was, whether that's pretentious or not, that was my interest at the time. And but it's also an argument for a kind of what you might call subjectivity in fiction. You know, I really wanted to write something that is about a perspective on the world from a very particular place. And the book is set in Liverpool. The narrator, the main character, it's a first-person book. The narrator is very much like me. And as narcissistic as it sounds, that's by intent. I wanted to give the world from the perspective of someone very much like myself. Because I thought there was something to contribute there, and
because there aren't many Luke Carmans in literature.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. In any way, shape, or form. So that's where I was coming from when I did that. I don't know whether that was misguided or not, but that's what I did. And it worked for me. I don't know.
I think that it certainly worked. I'm interested now in more of your kind of deliberate techniques of characterization. So I think that when we're learning to write and we think about what defines a character, we think back to those things that we learned at school, for example, like a character is defined by what they look like. So you make sure that you put in that they've got blonde hair, or that they're 5'6", or you know, that they're thin or fat or have crooked teeth. These kind of details, though, they're not necessarily the most telling details about character. So I could walk into any room at any time and find 6 ladies that were kind of blonde and around the same height and about the same body build that all look very different. But describing them by those details, it wouldn't distinguish them. I think, you know, some of those more telling details, some of those things that really distinguish people in real life and on the page, you know, are things like your body language, things like your word choice. I'm wondering, what are some of the things that, those telling details that define the character of Luke Carman in text?
Well, I think just to go back, I'll just go back to the very beginning, because that's where it all started to come together for me, was when I came up with this, you know, unusual beginning, where it's, my name is Luke Francis Carman, don't call me Mr. Carman, that's my mother's name for me when sorting out the mail. Example, here's one for you, Mr. Carman. What worked for me there was the idea that there's this very specific ritual of sorting the mail, in which the character is differentiated by his mother from his father.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it's the most quotidian, prosaic kind of interaction you can imagine. Someone just sorting through the mail and just deciding, yes, this one is for you. But I think what way it worked for me was that it was a simple, ordinary detail which captures the entire family dynamic. Like, you can tell from that very opening, those few sentences, that there's no father in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And the family is a so-called broken family. The parents are divorced, and there's some strangeness about the relationship between the mother and the father and the male because of that. And that has all kinds of implications which are successful from my point of view, because they're not direct. You know, I'm not coming out and trying to explain that this is the family situation. It's all kind of indirectly told. It's subtle, if you like, if that's not too much of a compliment to it. I mean that just in the fact that it's indirect. But I think that's the way that details work best, is when they are on the periphery, sort of resonance between not just the character that you're trying to create, but the experiences of your readers. So it's almost like you're tapping into a few different worlds at once. You know, it's the world of the character that you've written about, but it's also a more general picture. And I think that's when characters they're most interesting, is when they They're very specific, but they also have a resonance that the reader can sort of sink their teeth into, or that they can feel about their own lives in some way. So I think those are the kinds of details that I like, the sort of things that set off, if you like, a sequence of reactions in the mind of the reader. But it's it's not something that you can plan for necessarily. I think it's something that you have to look and discover for each character. It's not something you can sort of have a shopping list of. It's something you've got to really work for, if that makes sense.
I love your the point that you're making in particular at the beginning there, that often a character is defined by absences, and the absences in his life. So you imply at the beginning of that text that the father figure is missing. That's a point of characterization. That's something that defines Luke Carman. Whether he comes from a kind of broken family and the father is there at some points and not there at other points. That's an important part in what shapes the character of Luke Carman in your text. So that's an interesting way also to think about characterization, that characterization is not just the details that we put in, but the things that we leave out, and how those details we put in and leave out shape the reader's understanding of a character. What you've done, again, you've emphasized that idea of subtlety, which is, again, something that's really hard to achieve, I think, particularly for younger and emerging writers. How do we present characters that have something to say and that mean so much and that say so much about the wider world without whacking people over the head, without being too obvious? And that's what's interesting, again, about some of the absences of details in your text that create that subtlety. So again, creating character, I think the point that we've kind of come to there is that it's not just about what is left in, but also what is left out. There is no kind of picture of exactly what that character looks like in the beginning, but I think we really do actually understand the way that he holds himself, the way that he kind of shies away from conflict, for example, and shies away even from physical contact at a lot of points in the text. That's a really telling detail. If you think about just what the really telling details are about your character and what the key absences are with your character, you can create, I think, a character like yours who is really complex and layered and subtle, and yet has so much wider resonance. One of the things that we've talked about with my students in this Express Media course so far is that idea that the story is a moment in time to catch something else. So this idea that we concentrate on those small specific details, but that they have that resonance, that they are about more than just that moment. So Luke Carman, for example, is more than just about the character of Luke Carman. He represents wider ideas about isolation, about the difficulty of growing up in suburbia in general, I would say, of being a kind of intellectual guy in a space that doesn't value that, of being someone who considers themselves to be on the fringes or on the margins of a lot of different things like class and race and place, right? Yeah. So Luke Carman is, in a sense, a net to catch a lot of more complex ideas. But you do that by really firmly placing us in specific details in a small moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's a big lesson for a lot of, I mean, I've been involved with creative writing teaching in one form or another for almost 10 years. And one of the things that I think happens with young and emerging writers is that they have a really solid idea of their character or the story that they want to tell, and they concentrate on trying to achieve an effect, to get something across, to make their intense feelings or purpose really direct to the reader, by coming out and just giving it all. But often it has the opposite effect. You know, so for instance, to go back just one last time to the example of the male, it's not the kind of thing that gives you much of the character, but it's part of their everyday life. It's part of the character's existence, and so it gives a reality, a plausibility to the character that trying to give you the character themselves wouldn't accomplish. It's because, you know, the characters, to seem real, they have to have their own life. They have to have their own things going on, which seem even more vivid if they seem like they're not even intentionally placed there. You know, so it's just something small that happens. It's just a day-to-day occurrence. It's just something with really minor repercussions, you know, that creates a really vivid character, I think. And I think one of the problems for emerging writers, young writers, is that out of a kind of insecurity, they want to rush to produce their characters as startlingly and as vividly as possible. But in effect, strangely, counterintuitively, it pushes the reader away because it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem like real life, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, because when we get to know somebody, like if you think about like when you're getting to know a person in, you know, real life, we get to know those kind of small details of who they are, and it's the actual really getting to know somebody is something that occurs over a large space, as those details are kind of teased out in conversation and in the observation of their actions.
That's right, and the way that you get to know somebody is not through what they want to present to you. And so if the writer takes on that, not entirely anyway, so if the writer takes on that task of trying to present everything about a character to you, even if they do it, you know, through external details, not necessarily thoughts and feelings, but if they just push it too hard, it ends up seeming false, like a deception of some sort, and the reader gets kind of suspicious and doesn't believe in the character. Whereas if you just sort of take the pressure off the character that you're trying to craft and just sort of let it live, it comes alive much more convincingly, I think.
I was trying to think about some other ways that we can define character so that we could talk about them tonight, you know, besides, again, that kind of what do people look like. And I think that another thing that often defines characters, or that defines at least complex and interesting characters, is both desire and contradiction. So I'm wondering if we can start with this idea of desire. So what do you think your characters desire? What do they do to achieve it? How does that help us to understand the characters in your text?
Well, I mean, the example with the narrator of An Elegant Young Man, I think it's very clear from the beginning of the story that what he desires more than anything else is a sense of belonging, and a secure, a solid sense of self. I think that, for instance, the relationship between the complex relationship between his parents and himself is highlighted at the beginning, because it's a way of talking about not belonging. It's a way of talking about being separate from a family unit, which is also a way of simultaneously talking about being isolated, alienated, cut off from society, and so on, in all kinds of different ways. But language as well is, I think, just inherently part of desire. Language is, you know, I think it just goes hand in hand with writing in the first place. A lot of literary theory talks about the fact that, say, like, you know, Lacan's psychoanalytic theory and so on, talks about the fact that language is about trying to fulfill a desire to be whole with the world, that language in itself almost prevents. Language is built on absence. You know, one word means what it does purely because it's not other words. You know, the analogy of the dictionary is something that they use a lot in Lacanian discussion, where if you want to know what a word means, you have to look up more words and then look up those words and look up those words. You never quite get somewhere whole and solid and final. And so I think that leaks into all literature. I think that that's what fiction is about in some fundamental way. But the kind of fiction writer that I am, I'm almost overwhelmingly interested in voice, the way
You
language.
can tell from your writing.
That's right, and the way the characters speak, and the influence that their situation has on the kind of language that they have. And so, for me, it's all about it's all about coming to belonging through language. So for me, those two things tie together. It's desire for wholeness and belonging, and it's in my characters primarily because it's also in me. I mean, that's why artists create, I think, because they feel that desire to complete themselves in some fundamental way, and that's exactly where I was coming from when I wrote this book. Yeah, and that's why I think I wanted to be a writer in the first place. But that's where my characters are coming from too.
What about this idea of contradiction? So I think that when we're thinking about our characters, we sometimes have the tendency to give them these really absolute personalities. Like, so maybe, for example, we have an Indian character and they have to conform to the stereotypes of what it means to be Indian, or a male character, a young teenage male character, as you have in your text, and they need to kind of conform to all these ideas of what it means to be a young man, or we have a character that's like really egotistical, and therefore we try to make them really egotistical all of the time. What I'm interested in is, I think that we create real three-dimensional characters when we build in contradictions. Right, so contradictions in their actions, contradictions in their personalities. We all know as human beings that we contradict ourselves all the time. So I'm wondering, could you talk about the contradictions that you built into your character? I think there's a lot of really interesting ones there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think that in that opening story with the interests of the narrator in Walt Whitman, it just so happens, it's no coincidence, that one of the most famous quotes from Walt Whitman's poetry is about contradiction, where he says, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. And it's the start of, in some ways, of an American tradition of poetics, which is about celebrating the self and ties into all kinds of ideas of, American exceptionalism and so on. But it's something the character desires, as we were talking about before, because he feels himself unlike that. He feels himself to be very much an Australian person, and as a result, terrified by contradiction. One of the characteristics that's often pointed to about Australian literature is that it's torn in a kind of contradictory split between being its own kind of writing, its own kind of literature, and at the same time trying to hold on to its inheritance as a colonial society. So it's kind of caught in this double bind, and the argument goes that for that reason you can find contradiction really in the heart of any Australian writing or Australian writer. And so, I was very well aware that going through university and reading Australian fiction and so on, I was very much aware of that tendency, and I wanted to explore it because I think it's accurate. I think it, at least in my case, from my own point of view, it resonated with my understanding of the world. And Liverpool, for instance, where I grew up, is
in Western Sydney.
In Western Sydney, yeah.
National.
Yeah, it is of interest to me. Well, part of the reason I was interested in writing about it is because I think it's almost a perfect Australian suburb. You know, it's to write about that is because it has no literary tradition. And so, for one thing, I could write basically anything and say to myself at least, if anyone else was interested, maybe, but I could say this is the Liverpool Australian literary tradition right here. This is its character. This is how it sounds. And I'd be free to do that because there was no one else to contend with.
You get to invent your
That's
own
right.
tradition. Yeah.
But at the same time, that's more or less the Australian way. That's what Australian English has always been about. And what it means is that you also can't get started. If you don't have a tradition to build on, you can't begin. Language doesn't work that way. It's always building on something else. Literature, fiction, poetry, whatever, is always about what's come before it. And so you're in a strange paradoxical situation there where you're saying on the one hand, well, this is new, but you're also having to acknowledge that it's not new. It's someone else's tradition that you're imposing on this place. So that's why contradiction is such a big part of the opening sequence, because there is a contradictory what would you say? There's something contradictory about doing it in the first place. But yeah, I think trying to resolve that or pretending it doesn't exist is a fatal move for Australian writers because it's a limiting one. It means that you sort of have to make a special case for yourself and say, well, I know Australian literature is like this, but I'm going in this direction. I don't think it's possible to accomplish that. I think you have to work, whether you like it or not, whether you like Australian writing or not, or Australian literature, or whether you're an anti-Australian literary writer or whatever it might be, you have to acknowledge the situation that you're in as a writer, and you have to locate yourself in your surroundings somehow. And that's what I tried to do with this book. But I think, yeah, you really have to, especially as an Australian writer, which I assume most of the people in your class are, you have to contend with contradiction. It'll be there whether you like it or not. And better to be upfront about it and let it into the text than to try and keep it out. Yeah.
Let's step back a little bit and look at some of the go back to some more of the basics of establishing character before we talk a bit further about voice. So obviously when we are writing character in the text, one of the big decisions that comes fairly early in the text is whether or not we write in first, second, or in third person, right? Each of these perspectives manages to achieve something different. So the first person, I think, which Luke writes in, and which I'm going to get him to discuss further in a moment, is one that relies very much on the distinct and individual voice. The second person, when we use you, is a point of view that sounds quite demanding, that is often used in a kind of didactic way, in a kind of teaching way. You will open the door, you will walk through the door, you will sit down on the chair. That's why it's not really used very often, because there's not much of a space between the reader and the writer of the text, and it gets quite uncomfortable for the reader. Or third person, which has quite a range in it. So you can have a kind of intimate third person that almost sounds like first person, but because it's not first person, you can have a little bit more range of perspective. So we get a bit of a larger view on what the world looks like from the point of view of the character, or a kind of very distant third person, which is fairly omniscient, in which we're not very close to the character themselves or to their mind or their thoughts, but that can be quite advantageous as well, because it can allow us to see all events. I often think of person as being like a camera. If you're writing in first person, the camera is basically like stuck on your face.
Yep.
And you're writing from, you can only see that view, the character can only see that view. If you're writing in a kind of close third person, then the camera is essentially like on your head. It's pretty close to you. You can see a little bit wider than if you were in first person, but not too much. If you're writing in an omniscient narration, then the camera is quite far from your head. You can see everything very clearly. Let's talk about, what do you see as some of the advantages and disadvantages of choosing like first, second, or third person for creating character? Like, why did you decide that it was, you know, and furthermore, why would you have decided that first person was the best point of view for you to tell your story from?
Essentially, the truth is I didn't have a choice. I think part of your task as a writer is to work out what your voice is and what your voice allows you to do. As a writer, you simply won't be able to do everything. You have a certain range. There are some things you can do, some things you can't. In my own case, the way that I think, the way that I translate my thoughts, whatever it is, the way that I write, just so happens to force me more or less to go to first person. And anytime I try to go in a different direction, it just doesn't work out. It's a failure. It's a total mess. That said, I don't think first person is the friend of the young writer, the emerging writer. It's in my opinion it's the least dignified perspective, point of view, if you like.
What do you mean?
Well, I think third person is the most dignified, because it steps out. It gives the author or the narrator, the writer, whichever way you want to look at it, it gives them a separation from what they're trying to do. Whereas when you're in the first person, as your first question sort of demonstrates, there's something narcissistic, egotistic about it. You know, you're in yourself in a way, which is very uncomfortable. And no matter how fictional it is, you know, the I is always you in some weird way. And that's a problem. The I is a problem in every respect. So when you're in the first person and you're using the I, one of the problems is its literal narrowness. It's a thin signifier for a very complex thing, which is a human being, and you have to somehow deal with that paradox. It's I, which cannot see itself, which cannot easily explain itself without constantly referring to itself, which becomes grotesque and unappealing and shameful, has to get us. And how do you manage that? It's very difficult to do, and it's difficult in a psychological sense. Like, often when people write from the first person point of view, they think the character that they're writing is coming across just fine, really rich and vivid and fulsome and so on. But often it's in your own mind that's going on. It's not happening on the page, and it just grammatically it forces you to be a bit more, to have a bit of ingenuity, because you simply can't have sentence after sentence with I in it, or it just really turns people off. So you've got to find another way around it. With the third person, it's much theoretically, technically, it's much easier to do. You can move in and out. You can just show us what the person is thinking. You can laugh at the person. You can make fun of them. You can point out their contradictions. You can point out their failings and so on. It's a really graceful position to be in, to be hovering over your character. The trap for third person is people, I think, have the sense, you know, young emerging writers, whatever, have the sense that third person means you can just say whatever you want, be anywhere, be everywhere, know everything, and so on. But you still need to be anchored by a perspective. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah, you still need to have a perspective all the time. You know, you can begin your story with a lovely description of the trees and the old church and the schoolyard and whatever. But without a perspective, it's really flat. You know, and then you've got the trouble of trying to move in and out of that perspective. That gets very complex too, and you can get lost really easily. So I think those are the dangers of the third person, as it were, the technical challenges. But second person, it's not even worth talking about. It's a joke.
It's used very. I mean, I know like Nikki Gemmell used it in the Bride strip there. But to be honest, I find it's very, very difficult to read because you feel like you're being shouted at all the time.
I mean, if you're already a published writer, or you really got a great idea on how to use it or whatever, then maybe. But one thing I just never understand is why young emerging writers want to make things difficult for themselves. Like why you want to do tricky shit? Just do the easiest thing possible. Keep it simple. When you're already published and you're working on your second novel, then you can start to change it up. But I think it's always better to just take it easy on yourself, for God's sake. Play to your strengths.
I think that actually that was a large part of what you were trying to talk about before with the first person. And when I say trying to talk about,
you're right,
talked very well about. Before it was that idea of like going with your strengths, and nobody actually, like for example, my strength is definitely not dialogue. But nobody has ever actually pointed out to me, either in the editing stages or readers when I go to festivals or schools or anything, that my characters hardly talk. Nobody seems to notice. But if you look at my books, there's barely a line of dialogue in there. Nobody notices because I play to my strengths. I know that my strength is in interior dialogue and in description, and I know that one day I'll come to the point where I want to work more outside of my comfort zone to develop myself as a writer. But now I just want to play to my strengths.
Absolutely. I think that's a big part of what your job is as a writer, is to work out what as I was saying before, your voice has a range. You cannot say and do everything. Your favorite writer might be wonderful dialogue writer. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you. And one of the jobs you have is working out what you can contribute, what you do well, and building on that. And as you move through your career, you should be constantly developing, hopefully, and then you can start doing the things which are a challenge to you. But your initial task is just to work out the one or two things that you do really well and improving those before you move into the more complex stuff.
I think so too. We've only got about 10 more minutes, and please do send in some questions. If you've got questions, I'll get Luke to address those at the end before we finish the podcast. But what I would really like to address is this idea of voice. And I want first for us to define what we mean by voice to the audience, because I think not only is it the most difficult thing to do in writing, to have a voice, but it's even difficult to work out what that word means. So let's start from the point of view of like, what does voice mean?
Okay, for me, voice it's something like style. But it's more than that. If style is a way of doing or a way of being done, voice is that, and also what you are. Voice is what you, when someone sees your name on the cover of a book or sees it, mentioned somewhere, and you're a writer, the audience should immediately hear your voice in their head. It's what that's who you are. It's your meaning as a writer. And so in part it's your style, but it's not just the way you say things, it's also your subject and your content. And that's very much my take on it. And as a writer who is obsessed with voice, rather than say, plot or structure or whatever else, that's probably why I see it as so essential to literature itself, to writing itself, to fiction, because that's what I like. When I pick up a book, I want to hear something extraordinary. I don't read for, it just so happens that I don't read for a good story. I don't read for escapism. I don't read for an interesting take on something. You know, what I want is an extraordinary voice. I want to be able to hear something I've never heard before. And that's what I try and achieve as a writer.
But how do you achieve it? Like,
well,
so what are those techniques that, say yourself or other writers that you admire who have a great sense of voice, what are the techniques that they're actually using in their text to imbue their text with a good sense of voice, with a strong original sense of voice, one that can be recognized anywhere?
Okay, well, I think sort of touched on this earlier. Martin Harrison, who passed away a few years ago, is a creative writing teacher, theorist. I think at Sydney University. And in one of his essays, I came across something which has stuck with me forever as far as talking to young and emerging writers, and that is that the most common situation for a writer who's getting started, who's learning the ropes, so to speak, is to feel that they are both too weird and too boring to be a writer. And you know, I have nothing to contribute. My life is not interesting, or alternatively, or as well, I'm so strange. Nobody's going to get me. You know, I'm just too odd. Nobody can relate to anything I think or feel or whatever. And to varying degrees, I found that to be ubiquitous with young writers and emerging writers. Is that, and it plays out in a sense in the way that they tend to imitate in a really strict fashion what they want to do. You know, they have their influences, the writers that they like, or they have a story they want to tell, and they're really strict about, this is the way I'm going to tell it. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write like a writer. And the end result of that is that they don't learn to listen to themselves, to listen to what's actually going on in their head. Because I think, you know, there's a lot of different ways to write, but the way to write with an emphasis towards voice is actually to listen to that voice inside, that computational system inside your head, which comes up with sentences and paragraphs and so on. It's unique to you. Nobody else can imitate it, but it also means you won't be able to find it in another book. You know, absolutely, you should read as much as you can and be influenced by as many different writers as you can, but your own voice has got to come from inside. And unfortunately, it might not be the voice that you want. As I was saying before, I have to write in first person. That's the way here for me. And I know that because I've listened and I've tried to do it the other way, where I just write what I want to say. And those two things don't go together. So one is to stop. What my first piece of advice, it's vague, it's esoteric, I suppose, but is to stop trying so hard to be a writer and put your focus instead on the writing itself and the way it comes to you. To go back again to that stupid example of the letter, you know, that is just something that just it occurred to me. It just came to me as I was thinking this character through. It's not really what I was interested in writing about. That's not what I wanted. That's not. It had none of the effect that I wanted it to have. But the contradictory advice I would give to people is, you know, as well as not trying too hard, is to never restrain yourself either. I think that some of the best moments in voice are when you are driven to do something which you know might not be correct. I'll just give you some examples, like in Patrick White's Voss. You know, Patrick White, the only one of the most celebrated writers ever, Australian writers ever. In Voss, which is one of his most loved books, also one of the, he's also hated, but you know, Voss is one of his most well-respected. The first line is something like, "There's someone here to see you, miss," said Rosie. And the second sentence, which is also the second paragraph, says, "and stood breathing." Now, "and stood breathing" is a very, very simple and syntactically dubious sentence. But people have been pointing to that one stupid sentence for ever since he wrote that book as a marker of genius. And I think it is. I think he just took, you know, you could say, okay, he was a celebrated writer. Of course, he could take all kinds of liberties. But I think the liberties, the small indulgences, where you do something that might not even be correct, You know, it might be a bit indulgent or obnoxious or silly or frivolous or whatever. I think that's where you've got to create who you are. And for example, I remember the story of Clive James telling one of his editors once when he was working on a story. They said to him, you know, like, you know, you've got all these problems here, you've got to fix this. And he said back to them, yeah, but if I write like that, I'll be you. And, you know, his point was obviously that, you know, it's necessary sometimes for you to make a fool of yourself in the text, and to be unrestrained and to sort of let yourself go into weird and wonderful things. I think, I mean, we don't really have time, I guess, for examples, but one of my favorite writers is Gerald Murnane, and this is his collection of essays, Invisible Yet Enduring Lilacs. And I'm just going to quickly, just very quickly read you the beginnings of this. He says, meetings with Adam Lindsay Gordon. I remember an unseasonal cold in the air, an almost wintry sky, and mutterings around me from people I thought must have known the truth about the place. I knew little myself, and my father beside me was anxious, as usual, to be away. Now, that is just an incredibly eye-heavy introduction to an essay on another writer. You know, it's almost arrogant the way he's just really emphasizing himself. It's not arrogant, that's not quite the right word for it. But there's something about his writing in general where he just insists on the freedom to be a little indulgent, you might say. And people love him for it. I mean, he doesn't sell huge amounts of copy, but that's his style, that's his voice. He's really interested in his own memories, what he recalls, and he'll be damned if he's going to let you know, the decorum get in the way. And I think that's a really respectable position to be in as a writer. I think when we're talking about crafting character through voice, the central character of your development as a writer should be yourself. You should be working really hard to work out what it is that I do that people can trust me to do every single time. You know, I might not write the same story, obviously, but they need to trust my voice. They need to feel that I'm secure in what I care about and what I'm going to say.
I often feel that when I read writers such as yourself or Murnane or you know, some other writers that have great voice like Alexis Wright, for example, they have really distinct sentence structure and language use. So I'm sure that, you know, you and these other authors are kind of at the point where it does kind of come subconsciously. But I think for people who are struggling to establish a voice or trying to really think about what they can do to establish a clear sense of voice, I would say one kind of simple way in is to think about what language you use. So what are the kinds of words that are repeated throughout your text? What is the level of complexity of the vocabulary of your text? What is the style of your sentences? So so for example, I would describe Luke's sentence style as one that involves both simple sentences, but often a kind of pairing of many simple sentences when the scene becomes kind of confusing or complex, or the character can't quite comprehend what they are seeing. So I think that, you know, just to give our viewers some simple strategies in when you're thinking about voice and when you're thinking about all of these wonderful things that Luke has been telling us tonight, think really clearly about like Luke thought about Murnane's use of the personal pronoun I. That's part of a kind of, that's why his voice is distinguishable, because that's his kind of quirk that he uses as a writer, right? And other writers have different quirks. So think about what are those language and sentence structure features that really define your voice. That can be a really good way in, or even it can be a good way out, like, so something that you think about when you're in the editing process.
Yeah.
I don't think that we've got much more time left, but I'm just going to ask if anybody has any more questions that they would like to send us. I'm just going to have a little look now and see if there's any questions that anyone wants to send us. And if not, we might log off for the evening. Okay. We don't have so many questions, but we have some people are repeating Luke's statements all over the Twitter sphere. So that's great. I can see that we've really impacted a lot of people this evening. We might leave it there and say good night, and I'll thank Luke Carman for being my guest. For those of you who are in the Toolkits course now, I'll meet you in our Google Hangout. Bye.
Bye.
I think we're out. Sorry. Whoops, no. Bye-bye for real now. Okay.